The day my father had his stroke, his own brother had already called a moving company to pack up our house. I know how that sounds. I promise you, every word of it is true. My name is Claire Whitfield, and I grew up on 11 acres of orchard land in Vermont that my parents, Robert and Ellen Whitfield, built from nothing over 35 years. My father planted his first apple trees the same spring he married my mother. By the time I was born, that orchard wasn't just our home. It was theirs, in the deepest sense of that word. Every fence post and every tree, a small piece of a life they had built together with their own two hands, one season at a time. When I was 26, my father suffered a serious stroke while working in the orchard. He was rushed to the hospital, unable to speak clearly for weeks, unable to sign his own name for months. My mother, terrified and exhausted, leaned on the one person she trusted most outside our immediate family, my father's older brother, my Uncle Frank, a man who had always presented himself as the reliable one, the one who handled things when life got hard. Frank offered to manage my father's affairs temporarily. He had my mother sign a document she believed was a simple medical authorization form, allowing him to help coordinate hospital bills while my father recovered. What she actually signed, we would learn far too late, was a broad power of attorney. One Frank had quietly drafted himself, using a family friend as a notary who never properly verified what he was witnessing. Within 4 months, while my father was still relearning how to speak in a rehabilitation facility 2 hours from home, Frank used that power of attorney to take out a substantial loan against our orchard, transfer the property title into a trust he personally controlled, and list our family's home for sale. My mother found out when a real estate agent knocked on our door to schedule a private showing. I was in my last year of law school when I got the phone call from her, her voice breaking in a way I had never heard before, telling me that Frank had already found a buyer, and that we had 6 weeks to vacate a home that had been in our family for over 3 decades. I told her not to sign anything else. I told her I was coming home. What I didn't tell her, because I didn't know it yet myself, was that it would take me 11 years and everything I had to get that orchard back. I want you to understand something about my father before I go further into this story, because it matters for everything that comes after. Robert Whitfield was not a man who raised his voice. In 35 years, I never once heard him yell. Not at the bank when a harvest failed, not at customers who haggled too hard at the farm stand, not even, in the beginning, at his own brother. He believed, deeply and quietly, that a man's character was measured by how he treated people who had wronged him, not by how loudly he could fight back. That belief nearly cost us everything. By the time I came home from law school, the sale of the orchard had already closed. Frank had sold it, through his trust, to a land developer planning to subdivide the property into residential lots. The 11 acres my father had spent his whole adult life cultivating were, within weeks, stripped of most of their oldest trees to prepare for construction. My mother wept the day she drove past and saw the bulldozers. My father, still relearning to walk without a cane, said almost nothing. He simply asked to be driven home, to the small rented apartment we'd moved into, 2 towns away, that he now called home instead. I confronted Frank myself, once, at a family gathering neither of my parents attended. He didn't deny what he'd done. He simply told me, with the same easy smile he'd worn my entire childhood, that he had made a difficult decision during a difficult time, and that someday, when I understood the financial pressures of running a business, I would thank him for acting quickly. I have never wanted to prove someone wrong more in my entire life. I spent the next 2 years, while working as a junior associate at a law firm during the day, quietly building a case in every spare hour I had. I requested copies of the original power of attorney documents. I found the notary Frank had used, a woman in her 70s, retired now, who admitted, hesitantly at first, that she had signed the notarization at Frank's home, not at the hospital where my mother claimed to have signed it, and that she had never actually verified my mother's understanding of what she was signing, as the law required her to do. It was a start, a small crack in what had looked, for 2 years, like an unbreakable wall. But a small crack, I would learn, is sometimes all a determined person needs. The next several years were the hardest of my life, and I don't say that lightly, because I watched my parents live through something far harder. My father's recovery from the stroke was slow and, in some ways, never fully complete. He walked with a permanent limp. His speech occasionally slowed when he was tired or upset. But the hardest part to watch wasn't physical. It was the way he stopped talking about the orchard entirely, as though even the memory of it had become too painful to hold. My mother told me, quietly, one evening, that she sometimes caught him staring out the window of their small apartment in the direction of the old property, 40 minutes away, saying nothing at all. I built my legal case slowly, methodically, around them, without ever telling them how far I'd gotten, because I couldn't bear to give them false hope if it fell apart. I gathered medical records proving my father had been incapable of understanding complex legal documents during the exact window Frank claimed my mother had properly consented on his behalf. I found banking records showing Frank had personally profited over $400,000 from the loan and subsequent sale, funds that were never once used for my father's medical care, despite Frank's repeated claims that the arrangement was made for Robert's own good. I found 2 other elderly clients of the same disbarred notary who had experienced strikingly similar situations involving Frank's small property management business over the previous decade. Vulnerable homeowners, recovering from illness or grief, who had signed documents they didn't fully understand, documents that always seemed to benefit Frank Whitfield in the end. By my 7th year building this case, I had enough to file a formal civil suit for elder financial exploitation and fraud, seeking both damages and, more importantly, an attempt to recover whatever remained of the original property, which the developer had only partially built out before running into their own financial troubles and freezing construction on the remaining, still undeveloped acres. I remember the exact evening I finally sat my parents down at their kitchen table to tell them everything. My mother cried before I even finished the first sentence. My father sat very still, the way he always did when something mattered too much for words, and simply asked me one question. "Claire," he said quietly, "do you think there's still a chance we could get any part of it back?" I told him the truth. I didn't know. But I was going to spend every year it took to find out. The lawsuit took another 4 years to work through the courts. 4 years of depositions, delays, and a defense funded by Frank's considerable resources built, in no small part, from what he had taken from my own parents. What finally turned the case in our favor wasn't a single dramatic piece of evidence. It was the slow accumulation of every small crack I had found over the years, presented together in a single courtroom, in front of a judge who listened, page by page, to a pattern of exploitation that had clearly gone on far longer than just our family. Frank testified that everything he had done was in my father's best interest. He maintained, even under oath, that same easy confidence I remembered from my childhood, the tone of a man who had never once been forced to answer for anything in his entire life. That confidence began to falter when the retired notary took the stand and confirmed, clearly and without hesitation, that she had never met my mother at any hospital, and that Frank himself had instructed her, in his own home, on exactly which documents to notarize and how to date them. It faltered further when the 2 other elderly clients testified about strikingly similar circumstances, describing a pattern the judge later referred to, in her written decision, as a deliberate and repeated exploitation of trust during moments of profound family vulnerability. By the time the developer's representative testified that they still held roughly 4 of the original 11 acres undeveloped, including the section where our original farmhouse still stood, empty and unmaintained for years due to their financial troubles, I watched my mother reach for my father's hand under the courtroom table and hold it the way I imagined she had held it the very first spring. They planted those apple trees together. The judge ruled in our favor. Frank was ordered to pay substantial restitution and, through a negotiated settlement with the financially struggling developer, using a portion of that very restitution, we were able to purchase back the remaining 4 acres, including the original farmhouse, and return the deed to my parents' names alone. I called my mother the afternoon the paperwork was finalized. She was quiet for so long on the phone that I thought the call had dropped. "Mom?" I said. "Are you there?" "I'm here," she finally whispered. "Claire, is it really true? Can we go home?" I drove my parents back to the orchard myself on a cool October morning 11 years after Frank first had that moving truck called. The land was different than either of them remembered. 7 of the original acres were gone forever, replaced by half-finished residential lots the developer had eventually abandoned entirely. Most of the oldest apple trees, the ones my father had planted the same spring he married my mother, had been cleared out years earlier and were simply gone. But the farmhouse was still standing. My father asked me to stop the car at the end of the old driveway, and he sat there for a long moment, just looking at it, his hand resting quietly on the door handle. I didn't rush him. I don't think I could have, even if I'd wanted to. When he finally stepped out of the car, using the cane he still needed after all these years, he walked slowly up the overgrown path toward the front porch, my mother beside him, her arm looped gently through his. I stayed a few steps behind, watching two people who had lost and waited 11 years to reclaim the single place on earth that had ever truly felt like home to them. My mother stopped at the base of one surviving apple tree. One of the very few Frank's development plans had somehow left untouched, right beside the porch steps. She reached up and touched a low branch the way you might touch the shoulder of an old friend you never expected to see again. "This one," she said quietly, her voice catching. "Robert, this is the one you planted our first spring here. Do you remember?" My father didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was thick with something I had never once heard from him in my entire life. Not during the stroke, not during the years of loss, not even the day we'd been told we had 6 weeks to leave. "I remember everything, Ellen," he said softly. "I never stopped remembering. I just didn't think I'd ever get to stand here again." My parents have lived back in that farmhouse for 3 years now. The orchard will never be what it once was. 7 acres and 35 years of full-grown trees are not something you get back, no matter how long you fight or how much restitution a court awards you. Some losses simply cannot be undone completely, and I think, in some ways, my parents have made peace with carrying that particular grief for the rest of their lives. But every spring, my father plants a new tree beside that one surviving apple tree my mother touched the day we came home. Slowly, patiently, the same way he built the entire orchard the first time. One tree at a time, one season at a time, at 81 years old, with hands that still shake slightly from the stroke but have never once stopped wanting to plant something and watch it grow. I visited them 2 weekends ago. I found my father sitting on the porch steps at sunset, the way he used to when I was a girl, watching the light move across what remains of the land he built with his own hands. My mother was beside him, her head resting gently on his shoulder, the two of them saying nothing at all, because after everything they had lost and everything it took to get even part of it back, I think they finally understood that some of the most important conversations between two people who love each other don't need any words. I sat down on the step below them, the way I used to as a child, and my father put his weathered hand on my shoulder. "Thank you, Claire," he said quietly, "for not letting Frank's version of what happened be the last word. For giving your mother and me our home back before we were too old to plant one more tree in it. I don't have children of my own yet, but I know that someday, when I do, I'll bring them to this porch, to this one surviving apple tree, and I'll tell them the whole story. Not the version where a family lost everything, but the version where a son spent 11 years making sure his parents got to come home. If this story reminded you of your own parents, or the home that raised you, stay a little while longer. Because some houses aren't just built from wood and nails. They're built from everything the people inside them were willing to fight for, no matter how many years it